The Tragic Fall of Charles II, a portrait of suffering and dynasty in the autumn of 1700. The most powerful throne in Europe was occupied by a man whose body was already a walking corpse. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, spent his final months in a state so horrifying that his own courtiers whispered he was possessed by demons. What they witnessed in those final days would haunt European history forever, as a dynasty that had ruled for centuries crumbled along with the rotting flesh of its final heir. The death of Charles II would not only end the Spanish Habsburg line but plunge an entire continent into a devastating war that would reshape the balance of power for generations. Yet the true horror lay not in the political consequences but in the grotesque spectacle of a human being slowly disintegrating while desperate courtiers performed increasingly brutal rituals to save both their king and their empire. This is the story of how centuries of royal inbreeding created a monster of human suffering and how the final days of one man's agony changed the course of world history. The medical records and eyewitness accounts from Charles's deathbed paint a picture so disturbing that many historians have struggled to convey the full extent of his suffering. What you're about to hear is not merely the story of a king's death, but a testament to the devastating consequences of absolute power corrupted by genetic catastrophe. A dynasty in decay. The Habsburg legacy. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty had ruled one of the world's largest empires for over 2 centuries, controlling vast territories from the Americas to the Philippines. By the late 1600s, Spain remained a formidable power. But cracks were beginning to show not only in the empire but also within its ruling family. The Habsburgs had practiced strategic intermarriage for generations, believing it would keep their bloodline pure and their power consolidated. Marriages between cousins and even uncles and nieces became common, creating a family tree that was incredibly intertwined, often at tremendous cost to the health and well-being of its members. Charles II was born in 1661 as the product of centuries of this deliberate inbreeding. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins, and his great-grandparents shared the same disturbing pattern of close blood relations. By the time Charles was conceived, the Habsburg family gene pool had become so restricted that he had an inbreeding coefficient higher than that of children born to full siblings. The Spanish court was acutely aware that their royal line was producing increasingly unstable heirs. Charles's older brother, Philip Prospero, died at the tender age of 4, and several other potential heirs perished in childhood or infancy. The pressure on Charles to survive and produce an heir was immense, as the continuation of Habsburg rule in Spain depended entirely on his survival. From birth, Charles displayed the physical and mental disabilities that would plague him throughout his life. He could not walk until age 8, could not speak clearly until much older, and suffered from what contemporary accounts describe as an enlarged tongue and severely protruding jaw, along with numerous other deformities. This peculiar jawline became known as the Habsburg jaw, a physical trait emblematic of the family's genetic misfortunes. His mental capacity was severely limited. He was prone to seizures and fits of uncontrollable behavior. Despite these obvious disabilities, Charles was crowned King of Spain in 1665 at the age of 4 following his father's death. His mother, Queen Mariana, served as regent during his minority, desperately trying to maintain the fiction that her son was capable of ruling one of the world's great empires. As he grew, it became apparent that Charles was not merely a physically frail child but a fragile ruler. Observers noted his erratic behavior, struggles with coordination, and inability to exercise authority. The Spanish court became increasingly isolated and paranoid as neighboring powers began to circle like vultures. Sensing weakness, the political situation in Europe became perilous. Louis XIV of France had been expanding his territory and influence, while the Holy Roman Empire under Leopold I sought to maintain the balance of power. Both monarchs had legitimate claims to the Spanish throne through their Habsburg connections and were waiting for Charles II to die without an heir. The question of Spanish succession became the most pressing diplomatic issue in Europe, threatening to unravel the stability of the continent. A desperate search for heirs throughout his reign, Charles II made 2 desperate attempts to secure an heir, both marred by tragedy. His first marriage was to Marie-Louise of Orleans, the beautiful daughter of the Duke of Orleans. In 1679, despite the initial celebrations and hopes, their union ended in heartbreak when she died under mysterious circumstances in 1689, possibly from poisoning after failing to produce children. This tragedy sank Charles into deeper despair, highlighting the profound and tragic irony of a king so desperate for an heir yet unable to escape the genetic burdens imposed by his lineage. In 1690, Charles remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a union viewed as essential to strengthening the Habsburg claim to the Spanish throne. However, the marriage also proved fruitless. Charles's physical condition, beset by ailments and deformities, made it almost impossible for him to father children, and as his health declined, so too did his hopes for a legacy. By 1700, the Spanish court was in a state of barely controlled panic. The king's health was deteriorating rapidly, and foreign powers were positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. A body in decline. The autumn of 1700 as autumn descended in 1700. Charles II's physical and mental state worsened dramatically. Court physicians documented that he could barely walk without assistance, his legs unable to support his emaciated frame. His famous Habsburg jaw had become so pronounced that he could not properly close his mouth, which caused him to drool incessantly and made speech nearly incomprehensible. His attempts to eat became a grotesque spectacle of food spilling from his mouth, and swallowing grew increasingly difficult. Contemporary accounts described Charles's appearance as deeply disturbing to those who encountered him. The Venetian ambassador reported that the king's face was ghastly pale, with large, prominent eyes that seemed to bulge from their sockets. His skin had taken on a waxy, almost translucent quality, and his hair began falling out in patches, leaving him partially bald despite being only in his late 30s. The king's mental state mirrored his physical decline. He would often stare blankly for hours, seemingly unaware of his surroundings before suddenly erupting into fits of screaming or uncontrollable laughter. Palace servants reported that he sometimes conversed with invisible beings, carrying on elaborate discussions with empty air, or became convinced that he was being followed by shadowy figures that only he could see. With his digestive system essentially failing, court records indicated that Charles suffered from chronic diarrhea, often soiling himself during official ceremonies, much to the horror of visiting dignitaries. He could retain only the smallest amounts of food, usually thin broths or watered wine, and even those simple sustenance were often vomited back within hours. Sleep became elusive for the dying king. Palace guards reported hearing him scream in terror throughout the night, yet when they rushed to his chambers he would be found alone, cowering in bed and claiming that demons tormented him. This insomnia grew so severe that he would sometimes go days without meaningful rest, further accelerating his physical and mental decline. The smell emanating from Charles's body became foul. Courtiers would douse themselves in perfume before entering his presence. Several accounts described a sweet, sickly odor of decay that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His breath was so putrid that even his closest advisors struggled to keep from retching when he spoke directly to them. Perhaps most disturbing were the seizures that began to rack his body with increasing frequency. These episodes would leave him writhing on the floor, his eyes rolled back, foam pouring from his mouth as his body convulsed uncontrollably. Recovery from each seizure took longer than the last, and observers noted that he seemed to lose a little more of his humanity with each attack. Medical desperation and superstitions, the royal physicians were completely baffled by their patient's condition. They had tried bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to slow Charles's inexorable slide toward death. Desperate and running out of conventional treatments, they began to suspect that natural medicine alone could not save their king. As Charles II's condition continued to worsen throughout the final months of 1700, the Spanish court started to embrace increasingly desperate and supernatural explanations for their king's suffering. The royal physicians, having exhausted their medical knowledge, whispered that perhaps the king's ailments were not of natural origin. Court theologians and priests were summoned to examine Charles. Many concluded that his symptoms were consistent with demonic possession. The decision to pursue exorcism was not made lightly. The Spanish Inquisition, still a powerful force in 1700, required extensive documentation and testimony before authorizing such extreme measures. Witnesses were called to testify about the king's strange behaviors, his conversations with invisible entities, and his supernatural strength during seizures. The evidence seemed overwhelming to the superstitious minds of the Spanish court. Father Antonio Maricar, the court's chief exorcist, was summoned to examine the king personally. His report, preserved in Spanish archives, describes Charles as exhibiting all the classical signs of diabolical possession, including speaking in unknown tongues, displaying superhuman strength, and demonstrating knowledge of events he could not possibly have witnessed. The priest recommended immediate and intensive exorcism procedures. The first formal exorcism took place in the king's private chambers on a cold November evening. Charles was restrained in his bed as Father Maricar began the lengthy Latin prayers designed to cast out evil spirits. The king's response was immediate and terrifying. He began screaming in what witnesses described as multiple voices, some high-pitched, like a child's, others deep and guttural, like an animal's growl. The exorcism sessions quickly became public spectacles, with members of the Spanish nobility invited to witness the battle for their king's soul. The spectacle of desperation, Charles was bound to his bed with leather straps as priests sprinkled holy water and burned incense around his writhing form. The king's reactions grew increasingly violent with each session as he scratched at his restraints until his wrists bled and bit his own tongue until his mouth filled with blood. These brutal sessions often lasted for hours. Charles would scream prayers and curses in Spanish, Latin, and what observers claimed were unknown demonic languages. The physical toll was enormous. After each exorcism, the king was left unconscious and barely breathing, his body covered in scratches, bruises, and burns from the holy water that had been repeatedly poured over him. Despite this brutality, the Spanish court convinced itself that the exorcisms were working, pointing to brief periods of lucidity that Charles occasionally displayed following the sessions. During these moments, he would sometimes speak more clearly or seem to recognize familiar faces' interpretations. The priests took as temporary victories over the demonic forces. However, these improvements were always short-lived, and Charles would soon relapse into his previous state of agony. Word of the royal exorcism spread throughout Europe, causing a sensation among foreign courts. The French ambassador reported to Louis XIV that the Spaniards had lost their minds along with their king, while Protestant nations used the spectacle as evidence of Catholic superstition and Spanish decline. The exorcisms became not just medical treatments but symbolic representations of Spain's desperate attempt to maintain its dying empire through supernatural intervention. The Marquis de Louvel, who served as an unofficial French observer at the Spanish court, left behind one of the most detailed accounts of Charles II's final months. His secret dispatches to Versailles, discovered centuries later in French archives, provide chilling first-hand perspectives on the king's deteriorating condition. His Catholic Majesty presents a spectacle so pitiful that even his enemies might feel compassion, Louvel wrote. He speaks with great difficulty, his jaw hanging open in a perpetual grimace that renders his words nearly incomprehensible. A personal account of despair. Louvel described witnessing one of the exorcism sessions, writing that the scene was more horrifying than any torture chamber he had observed in his service to the crown. The king's screams echoed through the palace corridors, causing servants to cross themselves and whisper prayers for protection. When the priests finally ceased their ministrations, he noted, "His Majesty lay as still as a corpse, his breathing so shallow that we feared he had expired." The king's personal physician, Dr. Miguel Fernandez, kept detailed medical records that survived in the palace archives. His notes revealed the extent of Charles's deterioration with clinical precision. "The patient's digestive system has ceased to function normally," he wrote in October 1700. "He cannot retain solid food. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to support our work. Never miss an upload. Like this vid, drop a comment, and share it with others to help us grow this historical community.